The quote was delivered on a Tuesday. Not apologetically. Not with the specific softening that people apply when they are about to say something they know will land hard. Richard Holt did not soften things. He had been in the Ferrari business for 31 years, and he had learned, across those 31 years, that the people who came to him with vehicles at this level did not want softening. They wanted accuracy. They wanted the number, stated plainly, with the justification behind it available if they asked. He said, $500,000. Minimum. Eleanor Voss was standing in her father's garage, her garage now. Everything was hers now. 6 months into the specific and unfinished process of becoming the owner of a life that had belonged to someone else, and she looked at the car, and she looked at Richard, and she said nothing for a moment. The car was a 1962 Ferrari 250 Gito. Chassis number 3413 GT. One of 36 ever built. Hand-assembled at the Ferrari factory in Maranello by craftsmen who understood that what they were making was not a product, but a declaration, a statement about what a machine could be when the person directing its creation cared more about what it did than what it cost to make it do that. Her father had bought it new. In 1962, for $18,000, he had raced it twice, Bridgehampton 1963, Sebring 1964, and then he had kept it. For 64 years he had kept it in this garage, in this specific bay, under a fitted cover that Eleanor had lifted for the first time 6 months ago, when she was going through the estate, and had stood in front of it for a long time trying to feel something other than how much she missed him. Richard said, "The Colombo V12 needs a complete period-correct rebuild. Original 1962 components. The sourcing alone takes 6 months. The documentation for provenance and insurance purposes," Eleanor said. "I understand." She did not say yes. She went inside. She sat at her father's desk, her desk now, and she opened the letter he had left her, the one the attorney had given her at the reading, the one in her father's handwriting on his personal stationery, the one she had read 9 times in 6 months and was about to read for the 10th. It said, "Don't let them tell you it can't be fixed. Your grandfather said that about everything. He was always right." She folded it. She looked at the window. She picked up the phone and called a number she had found on a flyer posted at 3 automotive shops in Stamford, Connecticut, a flyer she had put there herself 2 weeks earlier, when Richard's quote had arrived. And something in her, some specific inheritance from a father who had never accepted the first answer to any question, had decided that $500,000 was not the only answer available. The number rang twice. A man answered. She said, "My name is Eleanor Voss. I have a 1962 Ferrari 250 Gito that a dealer has quoted $500,000 to fix. I'm looking for a second opinion." A pause on the line. Then the man said, "What are the symptoms?" She told him. Another pause. Longer. Then he said, "I need to look at something. Can I call you back in 10 minutes? She said, "Yes." He called back in 7. He said, "Mrs. Voss, I think I know what's wrong with your car, and I don't think it costs $500,000. Eleanor looked at her father's letter on the desk. She said, "Come tomorrow." Eleanor Voss had spent her adult life making decisions. Not the ordinary volume of decisions that adult life requires, the quotidian choices of what to eat and where to go and how to spend the available hours. The specific, high-stakes, irreversible kind. The kind that had built Voss Capital Management from a 2-person advisory practice in a rented office in Hartford into a firm managing $4.3 billion in assets with offices in 3 cities, and a reputation in the institutional investment world that was, by the most reliable measure of such things, what serious people said about you when you weren't in the room, exceptional. She was 51 years old. She had been making consequential decisions for 23 years, and she had developed, across those 23 years, the specific and genuine confidence of someone whose judgment had been tested repeatedly under conditions that did not forgive error and had been found, repeatedly, to be sound. She did not feel confident in her father's garage. Her father's name had been George Voss. He had been a civil engineer by training, and an enthusiast by nature, the specific kind of enthusiast for whom the word was insufficient, because what it described was not an interest, but a vocation, a parallel life conducted alongside the professional one, as serious and as studied and as genuinely inhabited as anything he had done for money. He had loved cars, not casually, not in the way of a wealthy man collecting objects that communicated his wealth, in the way of someone who understood what they were, who could talk about the engineering of a Colombo V12 with the same precision that Eleanor could talk about a balance sheet, who had read every book written about the cars he cared about and remembered what he'd read, who had known the names of the mechanics who worked on his cars and had written those names in his racing logbook because he believed that the people who kept the machines running deserved to be part of the record. He had died in March. A Tuesday morning, quietly, which was not how Eleanor had expected him to go. She had expected him to argue with death, the way he argued with everything, directly and at length, and with specific reference to why the opposing position was wrong. He had not argued. He had simply gone, between one breath and the next, in the bed he had slept in for 40 years. And Eleanor had gotten the call at 6:15 in the morning, and had driven to Connecticut in the specific dissociated state of someone who is performing the necessary actions, while their mind has not yet arrived at the reality those actions are responding to. She had been going through the estate since April. The house, the investments, the library of 640 books, every one of them annotated in her father's handwriting in the margins. The racing logbook, a leather-bound journal that documented every competitive event her father had participated in from 1960 to 1967 in his precise engineer's handwriting, with technical notes and results and the names of the people involved. She had been reading the racing logbook in the evenings, not for information, for his voice, for the specific quality of her father's attention to detail, his way of noticing and recording, the texture of his thinking made visible in ink on paper. She had read the Bridgehampton entry, September 1963, a Saturday, the Gito running in the GT class many times. Her father had written, carburetor fault, before the start. Mechanic found it in 20 minutes. Float valve, he said. 20-cent part. Saved the whole day. Finished second. Mechanic saved us. Good man. She had always meant to find out who the mechanic was. She had never gotten to it before her father died. And then she had been in the garage with Richard Holt and his $500,000 quote, and her father's letter saying, "Don't let them tell you it can't be fixed." And she had looked at the Guido and thought, 62 years ago a mechanic found a 20-cent part that kept this car running. And now a dealer is telling me it needs a $500,000 restoration. And somewhere between those two numbers is the truth. She put out the flyer the next morning. Richard Holt had not been pleased. She had told him, on the phone, that she was seeking a second opinion. He had received this information with the specific controlled displeasure of a professional whose expert assessment has been questioned by a client who is not qualified to question it, not anger, but the precise temperature just below anger. The temperature of a man who is maintaining his composure, because composure is what the situation requires, and who is finding the maintenance of it effortful. He had said, "Mrs. Voss, I have 31 years of Ferrari expertise. I have completed 2 previous Gita restorations. My assessment is not a preliminary estimate, it is a considered professional opinion based on direct examination of the vehicle." Eleanor had said, "I understand. I'm still seeking a second opinion." Richard had said, "May I ask who you're consulting?" Eleanor had said, "A mechanic in Stamford." The silence on the line had lasted 3 seconds. Richard had said, "I'll be there when he arrives." Eleanor had not told him to come. He had come anyway. Joseph Carver woke at 5:45. He made coffee in the specific way he made it, strong. in the old percolator that had been his grandfather's, and that he had kept not because it made better coffee than a modern machine, though it did, but because using it was a small, daily act of continuity with a man he had loved and missed, and thought about every time the smell of the coffee reached him while he was still half asleep. He made Nora's oatmeal on the low flame, vitamins on the saucer, orange juice in the short glass. Nora had opinions about orange juice that were not negotiable, and Joseph did not negotiate them. Nora appeared at 6:20 with her backpack already on, which was her standard practice. She put the backpack on before breakfast so she couldn't forget it. A system she had developed herself at age 7 that Joseph considered one of the more elegant pieces of personal logistics he had encountered. She sat down. She looked at him. "Nora, you called someone last night." Joseph, "Yes." "Nora, after I went to bed. I heard you on the phone." Joseph, "You were supposed to be asleep." Nora, "I was mostly asleep. I heard the important part." Joseph, "What was the important part?" Nora, "You said you knew what was wrong with a Ferrari." He looked at her. Nora, "Is it Grandpa's kind of Ferrari?" Joseph, "Yes, exactly Grandpa's kind." She thought about this. Nora, "The journal kind?" Joseph, page 47. She went quiet for the length of 2 spoonfuls of oatmeal. Then, "Are you going to fix it?" Joseph, "I'm going to look at it tomorrow. Whether I can fix it depends on whether I'm right about what's wrong." Nora, "Are you right?" He looked at his coffee. Joseph, "I think so. Grandpa was right in 1963. I'm working from the same information." Nora, "Grandpa's information is 60 years old." Joseph, "Some problems are 60 years old." She wrote something in the small notebook she kept in her backpack pocket, a habit she had had since 2nd grade, writing down things her father said that she decided deserved to be written down. He drove her to school and drove back to the shop. Carver's Automotive was in a strip mall on Route 1 in Stamford, between a dry cleaner and a nail salon, which was the specific geography of a small automotive business that had never been in a position to choose its location on the basis of prestige, and had been in this location for 11 years, because the lease was reasonable, and the parking was adequate, and the customers who came here came because they had been told by someone they trusted that Joseph Carver was honest and capable, and those 2 qualities, in combination, were rarer than they should have been. The shop had 3 bays. Joseph worked them alone most days, with a part-time assistant named Dario on Tuesdays and Thursdays, who was 23 years old, and who Joseph was teaching with the same patience and the same standard that his grandfather had applied to teaching him. The journal was in the shop, not displayed, placed on the shelf above the main workbench, between a Chilton manual for a 1998 Honda Accord and a spiral-bound notebook of Joseph's own diagnostic notes. A leather-bound journal, 8 inches by 6, with the specific character of something that had been used continuously for decades, the spine worn. The pages softened at the edges, the handwriting inside shifting slightly across years as the hand that made it aged. His grandfather, Elias Carver, had been a mechanic for 41 years. Not an ordinary mechanic, though ordinary mechanics were not ordinary, a fact that Joseph believed firmly, and that his grandfather had taught him before he could fully articulate why it was true. Elias had been factory trained by Ferrari Maranello in 1961, one of a small number of American mechanics certified directly by the factory in the early years of Ferrari's American racing program. He had worked on GTOs. He had worked on the Colombo V12 engine, the 3.0-liter, 60-degree V12 that Ferrari had developed from the earlier Lampredi unit. That revved to 8,000 RPM, with a sound that people who had heard it described in terms that seemed excessive until you heard it yourself and understood that the terms were accurate. Elias had documented everything, every job, every car, Every diagnosis and solution and part number and margin note. The journal was a working document, not a memoir. It recorded what he had done and what he had found and what had worked and what hadn't, in the specific language of a craftsman who understood that the knowledge was only as useful as its ability to be transmitted. Joseph had inherited it in 2009, when Elias died at 84. He had read it cover to cover 11 times, not out of reverence, out of use. The journal was a reference document, the way his grandfather had intended it to be. Joseph consulted it the way he consulted technical manuals, when a problem presented itself that matched something Elias had encountered and documented. Page 47. He had read it 6 times specifically. The entry was dated September 14, 1963. Bridgehampton Race Circuit, Long Island, New York. A 250 Gito, chassis 3430E, presented to Elias that morning before the race with a no-start condition. His grandfather's handwriting, car won't fire. Owner G. Voss reports it ran perfectly yesterday. No mechanical events overnight. Classic signs, fuel wet plugs, flooding smell, checked carburetors, float valve in the left bank carburetor corroded and sunk, flooding the bowls, sourced replacement standard brass float valve, automotive supply, cost 20 cents, fits the Weber 38 DCN perfectly with minor adjustment. Installed, adjusted fuel level, car fired on third crank, 2 hours total. Owner very pleased. Good man, good car. Finished second. G. Voss. Joseph had read the name 6 times without knowing who G. Voss was. He knew now. He had known since Eleanor Voss called him and described the symptoms: fuel wet plugs, flooding smell, no start condition, and he had gone to the shelf and opened the journal to page 47 and read the entry for the 7th time and felt something that he did not have precise language for, but that was somewhere in the neighborhood of the specific, unsteady feeling of a person who has just understood that the distance between 2 separate things is smaller than they knew. He had called her back in 7 minutes. He had not told her about the journal yet. He had told her he thought he knew what was wrong. He had not told her why he thought he knew. He had driven to Nora's school for pickup and made dinner and read Nora a chapter of the book they were working through, and gone to sleep, and woken at 5:45 and made the coffee in his grandfather's percolator. He put the journal in his toolbox. He drove to Eleanor Voss's estate in Greenwich. The estate was on North Street in Greenwich. Not the largest property on the road, the largest properties on North Street made a point of being invisible from it, set back behind gates and tree lines that communicated privacy so completely that the statement became its own kind of ostentation. The Voss property was visible from the road, a colonial house, white, with a long driveway, and a barn conversion at the rear that had been George Voss's garage for 40 years, and that was where Joseph was directed by the property manager, who met him at the gate. He parked on the gravel beside the barn. He got out. He took his toolbox from the back of the van. He walked to the barn entrance. Richard Holt was standing in the doorway. Joseph had not known Richard would be here. He stopped. Richard looked at Joseph, at the van, at the toolbox, at the jacket with Carver's Automotive embroidered on the chest. He said, "You're the second opinion." Joseph, "Yes." Richard, "You work on Ferraris." Joseph, "I work on what comes through the door." "But yes, I know this engine." Richard, "This is a 250 Gito, the most valuable car in the world. It requires the specific expertise of certified Ferrari specialists with documented experience at this level. It is not." He paused. He looked at the toolbox again. He said, "It is not a strip mall job." Joseph said nothing for a moment. He looked at Richard. Then he said, "Can I see the car?" Eleanor was inside the barn. She had been there since 8 that morning, not waiting, exactly, but present. The way she was present in situations whose outcome she could not control, and that mattered to her regardless. She had the racing logbook in her hands. She had been reading the Bridgehampton entry again. She looked up when Joseph came in. She saw the toolbox. She saw the journal under his arm. She said, "Mr. Carver, Joseph, Mrs. Voss, thank you for having me." He looked at the car. Richard came in behind him and stood at the edge of the space present, watchful, with the specific quality of someone who has decided they are going to observe a process they expect to fail, and who wants to be there when it fails. Joseph set the toolbox on the workbench along the side wall. He put the journal beside it. He walked to the Ghetto. He crouched at the driver's side. He did not touch it yet. He looked at the engine bay cover. The Ghetto's engine was mid-front, accessible from the top, the louvered hood sitting above the Colombo V12, in the specific functional aesthetic of a car that had been designed around what the engine needed, rather than around what the engine looked like. He looked at the hood for a moment. Then he stood. He went back to the workbench. He picked up the journal. He turned to page 47. He walked to Eleanor. He held out the journal. He said, "Before I look at the engine, I need you to read something." Eleanor looked at the journal, at the worn leather cover, at the handwriting visible on the open page. She took it. She read. She read it. Once. She looked up at Joseph. She looked back at the page. She read it again more slowly, the second time, with the specific attention of someone who is making sure they are reading what they think they are reading. She looked at the journal. G. Voss, her father's initial, her father's name, her father's car chassis 3413 GT, the same chassis she was standing 12 feet away from, the same car that had been in this garage for 64 years. Her father's race, the race her father had described in his logbook as mechanic, saved us. Good man. She looked at Joseph. She said, "Who wrote this?" "Joseph, my grandfather, Elias Carver. He was a factory-trained Ferrari mechanic. He worked the Bridgehampton race in September 1963. Eleanor, this is my father's car." Joseph, "Yes. I understood that when you described the symptoms." Eleanor, "Your grandfather worked on my father's car." Joseph, "In 1963, before the race. The same symptoms you're describing now. He diagnosed it in 20 minutes. Float valve in the carburetor. He called it a 20-cent part." Eleanor looked at the page, at her father's initial and her grandfather's handwriting. At good man, good car. She said, "He wrote good man." Joseph, "Yes." She was very still. She looked at the journal, and she looked at the car, and she looked at Joseph, and she said, "Do you have the logbook?" Joseph, "I'm sorry." Eleanor, "Do you have no?" Wait. She went to the workbench. She had left the racing logbook there that morning, open to the Bridgehampton entry, the page she had read every evening for 6 months. She brought it to where Joseph was standing. She put it beside the journal. 2 books, 2 workbenches in different states of age, 2 handwritings. The same afternoon in September 1963, documented from 2 different positions, the man who fixed the car and the man who drove it. Joseph read her father's entry. Carburetor fault before the start. Mechanic found it in 20 minutes. Float valve, he said. 20-cent part. Saved the whole day. Finished second. Mechanic saved us. Good man. He read it once. He read it again. He looked at his grandfather's handwriting beside it. Owner very pleased. Good man. Good car. Joseph put his hand on the workbench. Not for support. The gesture of a person who needs to feel something solid while their mind does what it is doing. Richard Holt was standing at the far end of the barn. He had been listening. He had not said anything since Eleanor had begun reading. He was looking at the 2 books on the workbench with the expression of a man who has spent 31 years in the Ferrari business, and who is, at this moment, in the presence of something that his 31 years have not prepared him for. because his 31 years have been spent thinking about these cars as objects. And what he is looking at right now is not an object. He said nothing. He kept saying nothing. It was the most useful contribution he had made to the morning. They stood there for a while, not awkwardly, not in the silence of people who don't know what to say, in the specific held quality of people who are in the presence of something that arrived without warning and that is larger than the space that had been prepared for it. Eleanor said finally, "He never knew your grandfather's name." Joseph, "No. And my grandfather didn't record he didn't record your father's full name. Just the initial." Eleanor, "G. Voss." Joseph, "Yes." Eleanor, "He wrote about that race in his logbook every time he read it in the last 10 years. He'd read it and say, 'Good race, good mechanic.' Never got his name." She paused. She was looking at the two books, not at Joseph. "He said it twice that I heard." Joseph was quiet. Eleanor, he would have wanted to know. He kept the names of everyone who mattered to the cars. His logbook is full of names. Mechanics, marshals, fellow competitors. He believed the names mattered. He said the car is in the record. But so are the people. She looked at Joseph. "Eleanor, your grandfather is in the record now. I know his name. Joseph Elias. Eleanor, Elias Carver." She said it the way you say a name when you are putting it somewhere permanent. Then she said, "Can you fix it?" Joseph, "I believe so. The symptoms match exactly. Float valve, same carburetor, same failure mode. The part is available. I ordered it last night. It arrives today." Eleanor, "Today." Joseph, 2-day shipping. $18.99. She looked at him. She looked at the car. Eleanor, "Richard quoted $500,000. Joseph, "Richard's assessment is technically defensible. A complete period-correct restoration of a GTO at this level genuinely costs that." He looked at the car and made the assessment he's trained to make. Eleanor, "But that's not what it needs." Joseph, "It needs a float valve. The engine is fine. The car is fine. It has a corroded float valve that's flooding the carburetors. 62 years of age on a brass component that's been sitting in fuel. It's a known failure mode on these carburetors." Eleanor, "Known to whom?" Joseph looked at the journal. Eleanor looked at the journal. She said, "Known to your grandfather. In 1963. Joseph, "Yes." Richard, "The standard assessment protocol for a vehicle at this value level is a comprehensive restoration evaluation. You don't approach a $50 million car with a parts diagnosis. You approach it with a full Eleanor." Richard. He stopped. She said it without harshness. The specific quality of a woman who has spent 23 years managing situations and people, and the specific friction between them, and who has developed, across those years, the ability to stop a conversation with a single word without making it a confrontation. She said, "I appreciate everything you've done. I'll call you." Richard looked at her. He looked at Joseph. He looked at the two books on the workbench. He left. The part arrived at 11:47. Joseph had given the tracking number to Eleanor's property manager when he arrived, and the property manager had redirected the delivery to the estate, and at 11:47 a courier van came up the North Street driveway, and a driver brought a small cardboard box to the barn. Eleanor signed for it. She handed it to Joseph. He opened it. A brass float valve, smaller than a golf ball, lighter than seemed right for something whose absence had generated a $500,000 assessment and 6 months of a woman's worry and 62 years of an unanswered question. Joseph held it up. He looked at it in the barn's natural light, the October light coming through the high windows. Warm and direct, the kind of light that made the inside of a well-kept barn feel like a place where important things happened. He said, "Same part. Different decade. Same solution." Eleanor looked at the float valve. She said, "My grandfather said that about everything." Joseph, "What?" Eleanor, Same problem, different decade, same solution. He was a civil engineer. He said the fundamental problems don't change. Only the surface of them changes. Joseph looked at the float valve. He said, "My grandfather said something similar. He said the machine tells you what's wrong if you know how to listen." Eleanor, they would have gotten along. Joseph, I think they did. For 2 hours in 1963. She looked at the racing logbook on the workbench. She said, "Fix it." Joseph worked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Not because the repair was complex, the repair was not complex. It was precise. There was a distinction, and it mattered. Complex work required solving problems you hadn't encountered before. Precise work required doing correctly what you knew had to be done, without shortcuts, without the small accumulated errors that imprecision introduced into mechanical systems, and that showed up later, in ways that were difficult to trace back to their origin. Joseph was precise. He removed the carburetor from the left bank, the Weber 38 DCN, the same unit his grandfather had worked on in 1963, updated in minor ways across 6 decades of manufacture, but fundamentally the same instrument. Designed for this engine, matched to its fuel delivery characteristics, doing the same job it had done when Enzo Ferrari's engineers had specified it for this application. He found the float valve, corroded, sunk, sitting at the bottom of the float bowl rather than floating at the surface where it was designed to live, where its position regulated the fuel level, where its functioning was the difference between a carburetor that delivered fuel correctly and one that flooded the engine with it. He photographed it. He photographed it not for documentation purposes, though he would have documentation if anyone asked, but because he wanted Nora to see it. He wanted to show her what an $18 part looked like when it was the thing that had stopped a $50 million car. He removed it. He installed the replacement. He adjusted the fuel level, the specific setting his grandfather had noted in the margin of the journal. Fuel level 8.5 m below the carburetor face, confirmed by sight glass. Runs clean at idle and across the rev range with the micrometer he had brought for the purpose. He reinstalled the carburetor. He checked the right bank. The right bank was fine, the float valve was worn but functional, not yet at the failure point. He noted it. He would tell Eleanor. He would recommend replacement within the year, proactively, before the same failure occurred again. He closed the engine bay. He checked his work in the specific methodical sequence he used for every job, not because he doubted what he had done, but because checking was part of doing. The final step of the process rather than an optional addition to it. He went to Eleanor. She was sitting on a wooden chair near the barn entrance, not watching, exactly, but present. She had the racing logbook in her lap, and she had not been reading it. She had just been holding it, the way you hold something that connects you to someone you're missing. Joseph said, "It's ready." She stood. She put the logbook on the chair. She walked to the car. Joseph got into the driver's seat. He did not rush the start sequence. He primed the fuel system. He waited the correct interval. He turned the key. The Colombo V12 fired on the third crank. Not tentatively. Not after the hesitation of something uncertain. On the third crank, with the specific authority of an engine that has been waiting, and that has now been given what it needed, and that is doing, in consequence, exactly what it was built to do. The sound filled the barn. It was not loud in the way that careless engines are loud. It was full the specific inhabited quality of a 12-cylinder engine at idle, each cylinder contributing its fraction to a whole that was somehow larger than the sum of those fractions. A sound that people who had heard it described in terms that seemed like hyperbole, until the sound was in the room, and the hyperbole revealed itself as understatement. Eleanor stood next to the car and listened. Joseph came out of the driver's seat and stood beside her. They stood there together for a moment, the woman who had inherited this car, and the man whose grandfather had kept it running 62 years ago, and the engine ran. Eleanor put her hand on the hood. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, quietly, not to Joseph, or not only to Joseph, or perhaps to her father, or to the barn, or to the specific October morning that had turned out to be the morning the last thing her father touched came back to life. He was right. Joseph said nothing. Eleanor, he said, don't let them tell you it can't be fixed. He was always right about things like that. Joseph, your grandfather or your father? Eleanor, my father. She paused, but I think my grandfather too. She kept her hand on the hood. The engine ran. Joseph wrote the bill at the workbench. He used the invoice pad he kept in the toolbox, the same pad he used at the shop. Pre-printed with Carver's Automotive at the top. The carbon paper underneath making a copy for his records. The format plain and unambiguous, because Joseph believed that bills, like everything else in a shop, should be exactly what they were without decoration. He wrote labor, 2.25 hours at shop rate, $157.50 parts, float valve, Weber 38 DCN 1899 total, $176.49. He tore it from the pad. He brought it to Eleanor. She read it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. Eleanor, Mr. Carver, Joseph, the labor rate is what I charge at the shop. I don't have a different rate for different vehicles. Eleanor, you drove from Stamford. You spent a day here. Joseph, the drive is not billable. Eleanor, I want to pay you, Joseph. Mrs. Voss, the bill is what the bill is. She looked at him. He looked back. She understood, in the specific way that she had learned to understand things after 23 years of working with people, reading the complete message, rather than just the surface of it, that this was not false modesty and it was not a negotiating position. It was a standard, the same standard that had produced the precise repair and the methodical check sequence and the float valve photograph he had taken for his daughter. The standard of a man who had been taught by a man, who had been taught that the work was what it was, and the bill was what the bill was, and neither of them needed inflating. She wrote the check. She handed it to him. She said, "There's something else I want to talk to you about." He waited. She sat on the wooden chair. She had the racing logbook in her hands again. Eleanor, my father's letter said the car should go to a museum. He said it belonged somewhere it could be seen. He said he'd kept it too long. Joseph, it's an extraordinary car. Eleanor, he also said find it the right home. He believed in the right home for things. He thought objects had a quality of fit with certain places, and that finding the fit was worth the effort. Joseph, yes. Eleanor, I've identified a museum. In Connecticut. They have a significant collection of period racing cars, and they have the context for this one, the American Racing Program, the Bridgehampton history. Joseph, that sounds right. Eleanor, I've agreed with the museum that the car will come with full documentation, its racing history, its provenance, a placard that tells the story of the car. Joseph said nothing. Eleanor, I want the placard to include a name, beyond my father's. The man who my father called a good man in his logbook, the mechanic who found the float valve in 20 minutes before the race, and who my father never had the chance to properly thank. Joseph looked at her. Eleanor, would you give me his full name? For the record. For the placard. Joseph, Elias Carver. Eleanor, Elias Carver. She wrote it in the racing logbook. On the Bridgehampton page. Below her father's entry. In her own handwriting, the mechanic's name was Elias Carver. She closed the logbook. She looked at Joseph. Eleanor, your grandfather has been in my father's story for 62 years. He just didn't have his name in it yet. Joseph looked at the logbook. He said he would have. He paused. He thought about Elias, about the journal, about 11 readings and page 47 and the margin note that said costs 20 cents, saves the race. He said He would have considered that more than sufficient. "Eleanor, I know." She extended her hand. Joseph shook it. He picked up his toolbox. He walked to the barn entrance. He stopped. He turned back. He said, "The right bank float valve. Same carburetor, opposite side. It's worn but not failed. I'd replace it within the year, before it goes to the museum." "Eleanor, will you do it?" Joseph, "Yes." She said, "Same rate?" He almost smiled. He said, "Same rate." He picked up Nora at 3:15. She was at the curb with her backpack on and her notebook in her hand, already writing something, already processing the day into the record she kept of it, the way she kept everything. She got in. She looked at him. She said, "Did you fix it?" He pulled out of the school lot. He said, "Yes." "Nora, with the part?" Joseph, $18.99. Same as your great-grandfather's 20 cents, adjusted for 62 years of inflation. She wrote that down. "Nora, did it start?" Joseph, third crank. Same as 1963. She looked out the window. "Nora, so Grandpa fixed it in 1963, and you fixed it today." Joseph, I used his diagnosis, his solution, his margin note with the part number. I finished what he started. "Nora, how does that feel?" He drove for a moment without answering. He thought about the barn, about the 2 books on the workbench, about Eleanor Voss's hand on the hood of the car, while the Colombo V12 ran for the first time in however long it had been silent. About he was right. About the name written in the logbook, Elias Carver, in Eleanor's handwriting, below her father's entry, 62 years late and exactly on time. He said, "It feels like finishing a sentence that someone else started." The sentence was good. It just needed its ending. Nora wrote something. She showed him at the next red light. It said, "Grandpa wrote the beginning in 1963. Dad wrote the ending today." Some sentences take 62 years. That doesn't make them incomplete. It makes them patient. He read it. He looked at her. He said, "When did you get so precise, Nora?" "I learned it from someone who fixed things with $20 parts and charged fair rates and kept his grandfather's journal on the shelf above the workbench." He looked at the road. He drove home. The Gito went to the museum in December. On a Wednesday morning, an enclosed transporter. Professional handlers. The specific care of people who understood what they were moving and who had been selected partly on that basis. Eleanor watched it go. She had the racing logbook with her. She had the letter, the one from her father, the one she had read 10 times, the one that said, "Don't let them tell you it can't be fixed." She read it one more time. Then she folded it. She put it in the logbook, between the pages for 1963. The placard at the museum reads, 1962 Ferrari 250 G2 chassis 3413 GT. Original owner George Voss. Raced at Bridgehampton 1963, Sebring 1964. Donated by Eleanor Voss 2026. And below that, in smaller text, added at Eleanor's specific request, at Bridgehampton, September 1963. A carburetor fault was diagnosed and repaired before the start by Elias Carver, factory-trained Ferrari mechanic. The car finished second. George Voss wrote in his racing logbook, "Mechanic saved us. Good man." His name was Elias Carver. There is a category of knowledge that lives in handwritten journals on shelves above workbenches, not in databases, not in certified programs or institutional archives or the documentation systems of large organizations. In notebooks, in margin notes, in the specific, personal, unrepeatable record of a person who did something with their hands and thought it was worth writing down. Elias Carver worked on 41 years of machines. He documented all of them. He documented a 20-cent float valve on a Saturday in September 1963, with the same care he gave every entry, Not because he knew it would matter, not because he was building a legacy, but because the work was worth recording, and the recording was part of the work. His grandson read it 11 times. On the 12th reading, it fixed a car and gave a man his name back. 62 years is a long time for a sentence to find its ending. But Nora was right. It doesn't make the sentence incomplete. It makes it patient.